Despite the childlike glee with which many of us celebrate Halloween each year, All Hallows' Eve is likely one of the oldest holidays observed, at least in some form or another. The word Halloween is a portmanteau, and a portmanteau is defined as a word where, over time, people lazily smashed several words together in one phrase just to save time. In this case, that phrase is All Hallows' Eve, which in the early and medieval Christian churches referred to the day before All Hallows' Day. Also called the Feast of All Saints, this was and still is in fact a Christian holiday where practitioners commemorated Christian martyrs. Hallow is a term that means sacred or holy. Thus, churches and graveyards are often called hallowed ground, while its archaic usage was a synonym for the noun saint. Thus, All Hallows' Eve referred to the night before the day where medieval Christians feasted and celebrated the lives of various saints. And yet, Christians did not, at least as far as we know, invent the holiday. You see, when pagans, i.e. non-Christians, began converting to Christianity in the late classical and early medieval periods, the Catholic Church, or just quote-unquote the Church in the medieval period, purposefully aligned at least some Christian holidays and celebrations with pagan holidays in order to make it easier for people to adjust to the new religion. This is likely why, in the 9th century CE, churches in Britain and the British Isles began holding All Hallows' Day celebrations on November 1st. Admittedly, historians debate whether or not this is true. We don't have concrete evidence that this is why the church moved what had been a roving holiday to one specific time of year every year. But, if correct, the church did so to associate the Feast of All Saints with a pre-existing Celtic holiday called Samhain, which means summer's end. Although Samhain has been incorrectly argued to have been a festival honoring the Celtic god of death named Arwen, you might read that a lot, and it's not true. Those celebrating the day were marking the end of the harvest season and the start of the winter months, the end of the autumn equinox and the winter solstice. This aligned with a similar holiday in Wales called Calan Gaeaf, and although celebrations would have been held to commemorate this important time, we don't know too much about how they chose to commemorate it, except for brief mentions here and there in Celtic mythology and Irish folklore. It was at this time that most major crops were harvested, and in villages there were horse races, feasting, and even important meetings between local elders. Debts were paid, duties were honored, and in some areas all fires were extinguished and then relit using embers from a new fire begun by the local Celtic priest called a druid. This was a symbolic act of community unification and highlighted the fact that lighting fires and celebrating around potentially dangerous but hopefully controlled open flames was a very important part of the holiday. We also know that weaker farm animals were slaughtered at this time, not necessarily as some type of ritual sacrifice, but rather to honor a good harvest year and to prepare for the winter to come. According to the ancient Romans, the Druids also constructed the infamous Wicker Man at times like this, filling it with animals or, according to Julius Caesar, even people. These accounts are thought to be pure Roman propaganda, however, and little evidence exists that this actually took place. Still, there is some archaeological evidence that indicates the Celts practiced human sacrifice, although it is a controversial issue and there is no indication that those actions had any ties to Samhain. That said, the holiday was closely associated with both darkness and the supernatural. The winter months have shorter periods of daylight, after all, and remember that before electricity, it was hard for people to effectively illuminate the darkness. In other words, it was hard as crap to see at night. Because of this, most pre-modern societies developed myths and superstitions surrounding the darkness, most of them tied to the supernatural. Many of us in the modern world can't understand living life with that kind of darkness, and so I'm not sure we can quite understand the mystery, terror, and yet intrigue with which pre-modern societies viewed the night. As the ancient Roman poet Ovid wrote, quote, "Blemishes are hid by night and every fault forgiven. Darkness makes any woman fair," end quote. Sick burn. Because of this, the Celts believed that Samhain was a time that brought about dark omens. In fact, in one Irish myth, as soon as darkness fell on Samhain Eve, quote, a crowd of horrible goblins rushed out, and among them a flock of copper-red birds, led by one monstrous three-headed vulture, and their poisonous breath withered up everything it touched. In Ireland, a magic fog that made people invisible lifted briefly, allowing elves to appear and the boundary between this world and the other world to dissipate. In all, the holiday, quote, marked the boundary between summer and winter, light and darkness. In this respect, Samhain can be seen as a threshold, or what anthropologists would call a liminal festival. It was a moment of ritual transition and altered states. It represented a time out of time, a brief interval when the normal order of the universe is suspended and charged with a peculiar preternatural energy, end quote. I think we can all see how those concepts have lasted into the modern day. Fast forwarding to the Christian era, once All Saints' Day emerged as a day of Christian commemoration, it was argued that saints being venerated could act as intercessors on behalf of people's departed relatives and thus help their souls ascend more quickly to heaven. You see, according to Catholic doctrine at the time, once most people died, they had to spend a certain time in purgatory working off their sins. Yet saints, with their massive street cred, could intervene and shorten the process. Because of this, All Saints' Day was a major day of celebration for medieval Catholics, and this historian would argue that because Samhain was still likely practiced, at least culturally, in Britain by the time the Christian holiday came about, the two overlapped in at least some aspects rather clearly. Specifically, masses said on that day were believed to ward off hauntings, as ghosts were, quote, understood to be dead relatives who visited their kin to rectify wrongs committed against them while alive, end quote. Moreover, each Hallows night, bells were rung for the souls in purgatory, and in some areas, bells were even rung all night long to ward off demons. It seems likely, then, that the pagan supernatural aspects of Samhain were in some ways blended with the holiday venerating Christian saints, meaning the 2 days were a period of supernatural happenings of various kinds. Although the Protestant Reformation meant that many of these practices were suspended in England by the 17th century, there is clear evidence that people either openly continued such practices in violation of the law or perpetuated them in secret. Some community festivals continued to be held, harvest celebrations were never suspended, fires were often lit in communities to commemorate the transition from summer to winter, and in some areas bells continued to be rung, just in case. And yet this was also the time when hysteria over heretics, witches, and the devil were at their height. As we'll discuss in our witchcraft module, chasing witches to suss out the devil was an early modern movement, not a medieval one, and it was at this time that Protestants came to see the worshiping of saints as meaningless superstition. This in turn rendered all trappings of All Hallows' Eve and Day heretical, bordering on the demonic. As such, at least for British Isles Protestants, those days of the year were particularly active for the supreme ruler of hell and all his minions. By the 18th century, these different streams, residual influence of Celtic tradition, the Christian aspects of All Saints' Day, and fear of the devil, emerged to characterize the day then referred to as Halloween, especially in areas of Britain where Catholicism still thrived. Ghost spirits and witches were likely afoot. It was easier for diviners to predict future events. Fires were lit to ward off unwelcome spirits. Demons might have an easier time affecting humans, and omens were both more common and more powerful. In Ireland, fairies were more active, imps might cause mischief, and departed souls wandered the moors. All those specific elements of folklore from this period are debated. The key takeaway is that Celtic and Christian influences were blended to form the holiday we still celebrate today. As an 1826 letter from Scotland reprinted in a Kingston, Ontario newspaper noted, the writer happened to visit, quote, on the anniversary of what is dominated in the legends of superstition. Halloween and its mystic rites were duly observed by a group of rosy-cheeked lasses at the hotel. Near the witching time of night, half a dozen groped their way into the garden to pull cabbage stalks, end quote. Recounting the 1785 poem by Robert Burns, quote, "Some merry country folks together did convene to burn their nuts and pour their stocks and had their Halloween," end quote. So how did this holiday make its way across the pond to our corner of the world? Interestingly, Halloween does not seem to have developed a strong following in the United States until the 19th century. Historians believe that this is because many of the first settlers in what became the U.S. were Puritans who strongly rejected most aspects of the holiday. Many ministers even argued celebrating it was tantamount to demonic worship. This historian might argue that it continued to be observed in a more subtle and subversive manner, but that's purely conjecture. What is known is that in the mid to late 19th century, the U.S. received an enormous influx of both Irish and Scottish immigrants who likely brought a stronger tradition of celebration with them. And while in Britain the holiday had always had strongly religious sectarian differences, i.e. for a while, Catholics and Protestants related to the holiday very differently, in North America, both in the U.S. and in Canada, this did not seem to matter. By the 1860s and 1870s, there were yearly celebrations in most major East Coast urban areas and in major cities in eastern Canada, with common accounts of people lighting bonfires, telling folk tales, and dressing up in costumes. As the New York Herald noted in 1878, quote, "The forests and dells of the United States are too cold and tramp-infested to be thickly peopled with fairies and witches, but American ingenuity has devised an acceptable substitute. So if anyone failed to see dancing fairies and witches innumerable last evening, it was because he did not make the tour of the parlors of his acquaintances," end quote. The holiday was even commercialized by 1900 with various types of, quote, "nuts, candy, apples, taffy, figs, oranges, grapes, confections, and a good time," end quote, advertised for sale. That year's Democratic candidate for president, William Jennings Bryan, was even caricatured in the Chicago Daily Tribune as trying to divine his fate in the upcoming election on Halloween. Spoiler alert, he lost. So over time, Halloween grew from a Celtic festival in Britain, folded in Christian overtones, and then added in a skosh of the heretical before being carried to the United States largely by Irish and Scottish immigrants. By the early 1900s, the holiday was commonly celebrated and regularly commercialized, so much so that in 1919, American librarian Ruth E. Kelly published the widely popular The Book of Halloween, the first full-length book on the holiday. In it, she did perpetuate some incorrect facts about Halloween, but its publication and success display just how ubiquitous and popular the holiday was by then. Indeed, this researcher can attest that many facts about Halloween that people assume are true, some correct and some incorrect, can be pulled back to Kelly's book. Certainly, the illustrations alone are enough to show how common modern Halloween tropes were by then. I like the witch, but let's keep the kids off the roofs, okay? What's more, by that time, the holiday also had standard practices of worship, given the also popular 1920 publication Halloween Happenings by Letty C. Vanderveer. The pamphlet was a guidebook for putting on a Halloween party, detailing how to write invitations, decorate, put on various contests, tell fortunes, and share ghost stories. As Letty wrote, quote, "Decorations for Halloween may vary greatly, but black cats, bats, jack-o'-lanterns, ghosts, and witches predominate. Autumn leaves, corn stalks, fruits, and vegetables carry out the idea of a harvest celebration. Orange and black crepe paper are indispensable in decorating," end quote. Letty even included a list of excellent pun jokes to tell should one have a so-called black cat party, and some were so good that this historian had to pause a moment for a chuckle. You're welcome. Since then, Halloween has steadily grown in popularity in the United States. Between 1777 and 1920 alone, there are more than 72,000 mentions of Halloween in newspapers archived by the Library of Congress. Americans spend billions on Halloween every year, whether it be on candy, costumes, decorations, or haunted attractions. It's true that the holiday has had some pushback at times. In the 1950s, when the United States went through a post-war conservative push, and in the 1980s during the so-called Satanic Panic, But the holiday held strong. With the advent of mass media, i.e. radio and then film, images we're so familiar with today were developed and enriched, creating the complex lore of ghosts, ghouls, goblins, monsters, demons, witches, haunted houses, creepy clowns, and general supernatural chicanery. But those are topics I will address in other modules. For now, I shall leave you with some pithy words from old Letty Vanderveer. Halloween's the one time, simply purely fun time, full of superstitions born of old traditions. Gnome and elf and fairy, witch and ghost make merry on this last of dear October's days. At the sinking sun time, when the day is done time, as the light grows dimmer, pranks begin to simmer, and bewitching mystery adds again to the history of the last of dear October's days. Charms are in the air and spells are everywhere, airy visitations and hallucinations, matrimony patron saint weaves her superstitions quaint in this last of dear October's days.